Hancock, too, was delighted, but while he was congratulating Stannard on the success with which his green troops had executed the difficult maneuver, a bullet passed through the pommel of his saddle and buried itself in the tender flesh of his inner thigh, along with several jagged bits of wood and a bent nail. 2 officers caught him as he slumped, and when they had lowered him to the ground, Stannard improvised a tourniquet, a knotted handkerchief wound tight with a pistol barrel, to stanch the flow of blood from the ugly wound. Hancock himself extracted the saddle nail unaided, though he mistook its source. They must be hard up for ammunition when they throw such shot as that, he said wryly. Stretcher bearers came on the run, but he refused to be carried off the field just yet. He insisted on staying to watch the action, which now was mounting swiftly toward a climax. The gray-haired Confederate officer he had glimpsed through the screen of trees as he rode southward in rear of the center was his old friend Armistead, whom he'd seen last in California and did not recognize now because of the distance and the smoke. Working his way forward to assume command of the frantic press of troops after Garnett and Kemper had fallen, Armistead found himself at the stone wall, midway of the 200-foot stretch from which a regiment of Pennsylvanians had bolted to avoid contact with the charging rebels. There the gray advance had stopped, or anyhow paused, while those in front knelt behind its welcome cover and poured a heavy fire into the secondary blue line up the slope. He saw, however, that it would not do to lose momentum or allow the Federals time to bring up reinforcement. "Come on, boys, give them the cold steel," he cried, and holding his saber high, still with the black hat balanced on its tip for a guidon, he stepped over the wall, yelling as he did so, "Follow me." Young Cushing's 2 guns were just ahead, unserved and silent because Cushing himself was dead by now, shot through the mouth as he called for a faster rate of fire, and Gibbon had been taken rear with a bullet in his shoulder. Then Armistead fell too, killed as he reached with his free hand for the muzzle of one of the guns, and the clot of perhaps 300 men who had followed him over the wall was struck from the right front by the 2 regiments Devereux had brought down pretty goddamn quick from the uphill slope beyond the clump of trees. The fight was hand-to-hand along the fringes, while others among the defenders stood back, left and front and right, and fired into the close-packed, heaving mass of rebel troops and colors. Every man fought on his own hook, a bluecoat would recall, with little regard for rank or assignment, high or low. Even Hunt was there, on horseback, emptying his revolver into the crush. See 'em, he cried as he pulled trigger. Then his horse went down, hoofs flailing, with the general underneath. Men on both sides were hollering as they milled about and fired, some cursing, others praying, and this, combined with the screams of the wounded and the moans of the dying, produced an effect which one who heard it called strange and terrible, a sound that came from thousands of human throats, yet was not a commingling of shouts and yells, but rather like a vast, mournful roar. Neither on the left nor on the right of the shallow penetration of the center, assailed as they were from north and south by the double envelopment Hayes and Stannard had improvised, could the Confederates make real headway. Pettigrew's troops, advancing up their additional 80 yards of slope, which one of them noted incongruously was covered with clover as soft as a Turkish carpet, were in fact outnumbered by the defenders of the 200 yards of wall above the angle. Fry's brigade and part of Marshall's having gone in with the Virginians to the south, all that remained were Davis's brigade and Marshall's remnant, and though they kept coming on, torn by rifle fire and canister from the flank and dead ahead, they had not the slightest chance of scoring a breakthrough, and they knew it. The most they could hope to accomplish was to keep the enemy units in their front from being shifted to meet the threat below the angle, and this they did, though at a cruel cost. A Mississippi regiment, including the University Grays, a company made up exclusively of students from the State University, which suffered a precisely tabulated loss of 100% of its members killed or wounded in the charge, managed to plant its colors within arm's length of the Union line before it was blasted out of existence. And a sergeant from a North Carolina outfit, accompanied by one man bearing the regimental colors, got all the way up to the wall itself, but only because the admiring defenders held their fire as they drew near. "Come over to this side of the Lord," a bluecoat shouted, whereupon the two surrendered and crossed over with their flag. Some others availed themselves of the same mercy at various points along the line, but these were all, except as captives or as corpses tumbling headlong under pressure from the rear. Not an attacker got over the wall north of the angle. Blood dripping from his wounded hand, Pettigrew sent word for Trimble to bring his two supporting brigades forward and add their weight to the attack. Trimble did so, ordering Lawrence to the right against the angle and Lane to reinforce the battered left. Mounted, he watched with pride as they swung past him. "Charlie, I believe those fine fellows are going into the enemy's line," he told an aide. But he was wrong. Moreover, as he watched them waver and recoil under the impact of the heavy fire the Federals brought to bear, he was hit a bone-splintering blow in the leg he had nearly lost at Manassas, just over 10 months back, from a wound that had kept him all those fretful months out of combat. He passed the command to Lane, whom he succeeded only 4 hours ago, but stayed to watch the outcome of the action. Discouraged by what he saw, the 61-year-old Marylander, whose reputation for hard-handed aggressiveness was unsurpassed by any man in either army, went rapidly into shock from pain and loss of blood, and declined to permit his aide to attempt to rally the troops for a renewal of the assault, which he now perceived could not succeed. "No," he said slowly, sadly, in response to the aide's request. "The best thing the men can do is get out of this. Let them go." They did go, here and on the right and in the center. At any rate, those who had not surrendered and were still in any condition, either physical or mental, to undertake the long walk back across the shell-torn valley. This was harder for those within the angle, not only because they had to run the longest gauntlet between the two converging wings under Hayes and Stannard, but also because they were the last to realize that the assault had failed. For them, the letdown was abrupt and sickening. I looked to the right and left, a Virginia lieutenant would recall, and felt we were disgraced. We had for the first time failed to do our duty. It was only after he started back and saw for himself that the friends he missed were casualties, not skulkers, that he began to comprehend the nature of the failure and felt that, after all, we were not disgraced. He made it back across, as did June Kimball, the Tennessee sergeant who had resolved to do his duty and had done it, but who now admitted frankly, for about 100 yards, I broke the lightning speed record. Once more, however, his conscience intervened. With the horror of being shot in the back, he turned to face the bluecoats firing downhill at him and walked backwards until he was out of musket range, then turned again and plodded uphill amid shell bursts that plowed the farther reaches of what a Federal observer called a square mile of Tophet. Fortunately, the final stages of the withdrawal were favored somewhat by the advance of Wilcox and Lang, who came forward in response to calls from Pickett. Although Wilcox later reported that by the time he emerged from cover, not a man of the division that I was ordered to support could I see, his limited advance had at least the effect of causing Stannard, who was wounded too by now, to order his Vermonters back into line to meet this new menace to their flank, thus easing the pressure on those Confederates who were last to leave the angle and the more stubbornly defended portions of wall above and below it. Even so, barely more than half of the 11,000 men in the 9-brigade assault force, including Mayo's defectors whose losses had been comparatively light, and those disabled stalwarts who managed to hobble or crawl the westward distance across the valley, returned to the ridge they'd left with such high hopes an hour ago. The rest, some 5,000 in all, were either killed or captured. Further allowance for the wounded among the survivors, as well as for those who were killed or injured during the preliminary bombardment and in the belated advance of Lang and Wilcox, raised the total to about 7,500 casualties, which amounted to 60% of the 12,500 Confederates engaged from first to last. In the 5 leading brigades under Pickett and Pettigrew, the ratio of losses was considerably higher, no less indeed than 70%, so that it was no wonder that the former, writing 5 days later to his fiancée, spoke of my spirit-crushed, wearied, cut-up people, especially if he had reference to his subordinate commanders. Not only had he lost all 3 of his brigadiers, but of his 13 colonels, 8 were killed and all the rest were wounded. In fact, of his 35 officers above the rank of captain, only 1 came back unhit, a 1-armed major, and Pettigrew's losses were almost as grievous in that regard. In Fry's brigade, 2 field officers escaped. In Marshall's, only 1, and in Davis's, all were killed or wounded. Moreover, the Union infantry force, with half as many troops as came against them, suffered no more than 1,500 casualties, barely 1/5 of the number they inflicted while maintaining the integrity of their position. "We gained nothing but glory," a Virginia captain wrote home before the week was out, "and lost our bravest men." The gloom that settled over the western ridge was more than matched, at least in intensity, by the elation of the victors on the one across the way. On Cemetery Hill, watching as the rebel lines began to come unhinged, a captain shouted, "By God, boys, we've got 'em now. They've broke all to hell." And down on the blood-splotched ridge below, when it became apparent that such was indeed the case, a wild celebration got underway before the gunfire stopped. Hayes, who had had 2 horses shot from under him and had lost all but 6 of his 20 orderlies, was so exuberant that he grabbed and kissed young David Shields, a lieutenant on his staff. "Boys, give me a flag," he cried. "Get a flag, Courts. Get a flag, Dave, and come on." There was no shortage of such trophies, for of the 38 regimental flags that had been brought within musket range of the wall, here on the right and on the left, no less than 30 had been captured. Hayes and the 2 staff officers he had invited to join him in a horseback victory dance rode up and down the division line, each trailing a stand of rebel colors in the dust behind his mount, cheered by those of their grinning soldiers who were not still busy taking pot shots at the butternut figures retreating in disorder across the valley. Recalling his excitement, Shields wrote later, "My horse seemed to be off the ground, traveling through the air." His impression was that if he could survive what he'd just been through, he could survive almost anything, in or out of the catalog of war. He was going to live forever. "I felt though a shot as large as a barrel should hit me in the back, it would be with no more effect than shooting through a fog bank." Meanwhile, the nearly 4,000 rebel prisoners, wounded and unwounded, were being rounded up and sent to the rear. Smart, healthy-looking men, one Federal called them, adding, "They move very quick, walk like horses." It was strange to see them thus, close up and defanged, without their guns and yells. They had a simple dignity about them which their ragged clothes served more to emphasize than lessen. No, all of them in rags. Many of their officers were well-dressed, fine, proud gentlemen, another observer wrote soon afterwards. "Such men as it would be a pleasure to meet when the war is over." I had no desire to exult over them, and pity and sympathy were the general feelings of us all upon the occasion. This last was not entirely true. At least one Union officer was alarmed by the thought that the prisoners, who after all numbered only a few hundred less than the surviving defenders of the ridge, might take it into their heads to renew the fight with the discarded weapons thickly strewn about the ground at their feet. There was, as it turned out, no danger of this, but the commander of a reserve battery, galloping forward in response to belated orders to reinforce the badly pounded guns along the center, received a different kind of shock. As he came up the reverse slope of the ridge, he saw a mass of gray-clad men come over the crest ahead, and his first thought was that the position had been overrun. He signaled a halt and was about to give the order to fall back when he saw that the Confederates bore no arms and were under guard. Meade had much the same original reaction. Arriving at last from Powers Hill, he too mistook the drove of prisoners for evidence of a breakthrough. Then, as he realized his mistake and rode on past them toward the crest, he encountered a lieutenant from Gibbon's staff. "How's it going here?" he asked eagerly, and received the reply, "I believe, General, the enemy's attack is repulsed." Meade could scarcely credit the information, welcome though it was. "What?" he exclaimed. "Is the assault already repulsed?" By that time he'd reached the crest, however, and the lieutenant's assurance, "It is, sir," was confirmed by what he saw with his own eyes. More captives being herded into clusters along the left and right and center, his own troops cavorting with abandoned rebel flags, and the fugitives withdrawing amid shell bursts on the far side of the valley, all unmistakable evidence of a victory achieved. "Thank God," he said fervently. The lieutenant observed that Meade's right hand jerked involuntarily upward, as if to snatch off his slouch hat and wave it in exultation, but then his concern for dignity prevailed. Instead, he merely waved his hand, albeit rather self-consciously, and cried just once, "Hurrah!" This done, he gave the staffer instructions for the posting of reinforcements expected shortly, as the enemy might be mad enough to attack again, adding, "If the enemy does attack, charge him in the flank and sweep him from the field." He rode on down the ridge, where he was greeted with cheers of recognition and tossed caps. A band had come up by now from somewhere, and when it broke into the strain of "Hail to the Chief," a correspondent remarked, not altogether jokingly, "Ah, General Meade, you're in very great danger of being President of the United States." Despite the evidence spread before him that the Confederates were in a state of acute distress and therefore probably vulnerable to attack, the Northern commander's words had made it clear that he had no intention of going over to the offensive. No one on the other side of the valley had heard those words, however. If they had, their surprise and relief would have been at least as great as his had been on learning that their attempt to pierce his center had been foiled. This was especially true of Longstreet. A counterpuncher himself, he expected Meade to attack without delay, and he moved at once to meet the threat as best he could, sending word for Wright, whom he had halted when he saw the charge must fail, to collect and rally the fugitives streaming back toward the center, while he himself attended to that same function on the right. Now that the painful thing he had opposed was over, he recovered his bluff and hearty manner. He rode among the returning troops and spoke reassuringly to them, meantime sending word for McLaws and Law to pull back to the line they'd taken off from yesterday, and thus place their divisions in position to assist in the defense of the weakened center. When one commander protested that his men could not be rallied, old Peter mocked at his despair. "Very well, never mind then, General," he told him. "Just let them remain where they are. The enemy's going to advance and it'll spare you the trouble." Fremantle thought the Georgian's conduct admirable, and when he paused at one point to ask if the colonel had anything to drink, the Britisher not only gave him a swig of rum from a silver flask, but also insisted that he keep the rest, together with its container, as a token of his esteem. Longstreet thanked him, put the flask in his pocket for future reference, and continued to move among the fugitives with words of cheer and encouragement, preparing to meet the counterattack which he believed Meade would be delivering at any moment now. But most of the survivors came streaming back the shortest way, straight across the valley toward the command post midway of its western rim, like hurt children in instinctive search of solace from a parent, meaning Lee. There the Southern commander had remained throughout their advance and their brief, furious struggle on the distant ridge until he saw them falter and begin their slow recoil, whereupon he rode forward to meet them coming back, to rally them with words of reassurance, and to share with them the ordeal of the counterattack he believed would soon be launched. Nor did he disappoint them in their expectations of solace and sustainment. "All this will come right in the end," he told them. "We'll talk it over afterwards. But in the meantime, all good men must rally. We want all good and true men just now." He made it clear to all he met that he considered the failure of the charge not their fault, but his for having asked of them more than men could give. To Fremantle, who had ridden over from the right, he said, "This has been a sad day for us, Colonel, a sad day. But we can't always expect to win victories." After advising the visitor to find a safer point for observation, he continued to move among his soldiers in an attempt to brace them for the storm he thought was coming. Very few failed to answer his appeal, Fremantle noted, and I saw many badly wounded men take off their hats and cheer him. One among the fugitives most in need of encouragement was Pickett, who came riding back with an expression of dejection and bewilderment on his face. Leading his division into battle for the first time, he had seen 2/3 of it destroyed. Not only had his great hour come to nothing, tactically speaking, it added up to considerably less than nothing. Lee met him with instructions designed to bring him back to the problem now at hand. "General Pickett, place your division in rear of this hill," he told him, "and be ready to repel the advance of the enemy should they follow up their advantage." At least one bystander observed that in his extremity Lee employed the words "the enemy" rather than his usual "those people." But Pickett was in no state to observe anything outside his personal loss and mortification. "General Lee, I have no division now," he said tearfully. "Armistead is down, Garnett is down, and Kemper's mortally wounded." "Come, General Pickett," Lee broke in. "This has been my fight, and upon my shoulders rests the blame. The men and officers of your command have written the name of Virginia as high today as it has ever been written before. Your men have done all that men can do," he added after a pause for emphasis. "The fault is entirely my own." He repeated this as he rode from point to point about the field. "It's all my fault, the blame is mine, and you must help me." To Wilcox, who was about as unstrung as Pickett in reporting that he was not sure his troops would stand if the Federals attacked, Lee was particularly solicitous and tender. "Never mind, General," he told him, taking his hand as he spoke. "All this has been my fault. It is I who have lost this fight, and you must help me out of it the best way you can." Fremantle, who had not followed his advice to find a place of safety, thought it impossible to look at him or listen to him without feeling the strongest admiration. And when he rode forward to the line of guns, the Britisher found the cannoneers ready to challenge any blue attack on the disrupted center. They had much the same reaction as his own to Lee's appeal. "We've not lost confidence in the old man," they assured him, speaking defiantly, almost angrily, as if someone had suggested otherwise. "This day's work will do him no harm. Uncle Robert will get us into Washington yet, you bet he will." By no means all responded in that fashion, however, especially among the troops who had been all the way to the enemy ridge and back, as the artillerists had not. And even concerning those who did, there was considerable doubt as to whether they would stand their ground this soon after their delivery from chaos if they were exposed to more than the possibility of further danger. In point of fact, there was strong evidence that they would not. When some officers managed to form a line along the forward slope of Seminary Ridge, still in plain view of the Union batteries, the rallied fugitives broke badly under the long-range fire their concentration drew. Then commenced a rout that increased to a stampede, an indignant witness later wrote. Fleeing rearward over the crest, the mass of several hundred fear-crazed men was funneled into a ravine along the western slope, and there, without regard for orders or appeals from their officers, who were swept along in the crush, they pushed, poured, and rushed in a continuous stream, throwing away guns, blankets, and haversacks, until at last a straggler line, composed of the more stalwart few among them, was thrown across their path and dammed them up. Lee did not reproach them even then, knowing as he did that time alone could heal the wounds their morale had suffered in the hour just past. What was more, his ready acceptance of total blame for the failure of the assault was not merely a temporary burden he assumed for the sake of encouraging his troops to resist the counterattack he believed Meade was about to launch at them. He continued to say the same things in the future, after the immediate need for them was past, and the quite different but altogether human need for self-justification might have been expected to set in. "It's all my fault. I thought my men were invincible," he told Longstreet the next day, perhaps by way of making specific admission that he had been wrong in overruling his chief lieutenant's objection that the charge was bound to fail. And in his official report to the President, forwarded on the last day of the month, he repeated for the record his assertion that such fault as might be found could not properly be applied to the men who had bled and died to sustain his pride in them. "The conduct of the troops was all that I could desire or expect," he wrote, "and they deserved success so far as it can be deserved by heroic valor and fortitude. More may have been required of them than they were able to perform, but my admiration of their noble qualities and confidence in their ability to cope successfully with the enemy has suffered no abatement from the issue of this protracted and sanguinary conflict."